Good afternoon, everyone. My name is Stephen Nelson, and I am Dean of the Center for Advanced Study in the Visual Arts here at the National Gallery of Art. And I'm delighted to welcome you to the second of 4 A.W. Mellon Lectures in the Fine Arts featuring Dr. Mabel O. Wilson of Columbia University. And join me in welcoming Dr. Wilson to the lectern.
Great. Thank you, Stephen. And let me just get everything arranged. So I just wanted to say welcome and thank you to those in person and folks who are online who are joining me this Sunday afternoon here in the National Gallery of Art's East Wing Auditorium. I also want to thank Shannon, who is our ASL translator, and I promised her I would speak at a reasonable pace today. But this is the second lecture, and I do want to thank my brilliant graduate students who've joined my seminars on architecture, property, and race over the years, whose insightful discussions and research laid the foundation for this particular talk. So when I had the honor of being the Elsa Mellon Bruce Fellow at the Center 9 years ago, for my afternoon break, I would sometimes opt for a walk through the galleries. The Center is where I began research on the monograph, Building Race and Nation, Slavery, Dispossession, and U.S. Civic Architecture, that explores the intersection of race, nationalism, and architecture from the end of the War for Independence to the eve of the Civil War. It is from this draft manuscript that I have constituted my 4 Mellon Lectures, the second one I present this afternoon. Now, on one of these strolls, I came across Edward Savage's portrait of the nation's first family. Savage was a self-taught painter and engraver from Massachusetts. Now, he painted several portraits of Washington over the course of his career, which he often republished in print form as a money-making enterprise. The artist's biography on the National Gallery of Art's website savages his middling skills by noting, quote, "His talent never equaled his ambition," end quote. I just had to share that. It's a great website, by the way. Aptitude notwithstanding, I found Savage's details of the rich brocades and satins that clothed the iconic family, who he posed against a background of earthen ochres, brick, and forest greens, alluring and most certainly complicated. The allegorical dimensions of this majestic panorama of the Washington family, painted between the years of 1789 to 1796, piqued my curiosity to know more. And if, after my talk today, you wish to visit this iconic painting, it's currently on view in Gallery 62 on the main floor of the West Wing. Now, Savage portrays the Washingtons in a fictive room that opens onto a grand view of the Potomac River. This prospect is one that visitors can partake from the rear portico of the family's plantation, Mount Vernon, which was acquired in 1732 as the Little Hunting Creek Plantation by Washington's father, Augustine, with various additions over the years by George and his deceased half-brother Lawrence, to become the house we know today. Now, under George Washington's stewardship, Mount Vernon operated as a conglomeration of 5 farms totaling 8,000 acres. It is important to note that the Washingtons were typical of European colonial planters who strategically erected their plantations throughout the New World along waterways, creeks, rivers, and bays. This proximity meant that hogsheads, which were large barrels holding crops like tobacco, cotton, sugar, indigo, wheat, and rice, could easily be loaded onto boats and barges headed to local ports. In practice, these waterways also functioned as critical routes for the importation of finished goods like salt, coffee, wine, furniture, books, fine cloths like satin, lace, and brocades, and slaves from ports in the Caribbean, Central and South America, Africa, Asia, and Europe. A clue about the importance of commerce to the Tidewater region can be found in Savage's brushstrokes of the billowy masts of brigs and schooners, perhaps headed to Alexandria or Georgetown, a few miles up the Potomac. The sweeping vistas from verandas of plantation houses like Mount Vernon overlaid the aesthetic pleasure of the picturesque onto these working landscapes of profit and tyranny. According to architectural historian Lewis P. Nelson, the high ground enabled plantation overseers, for example, to surveil the activities of enslaved workers from afar. In his painting of the Washingtons, Savage transformed the New World's white planter class into an emblem of American citizenry and society. The artist put on view for the new republic's perusal a display of the first family's belongings and holdings. Savage's popular image of the Washingtons circulated in print form for many decades and was reimagined with mixed results by others well into the 19th century, as you see in these Currier knives, the middle one in particular. It's funny. But what the painting visually and spatially narrates in Savage's carefully orchestrated scene of planter domesticity are the intersecting realms of gender and race, property and nation. So let's take a closer look at his subjects. The artist positions step-grandson George Washington Parke Custis, also known as Wash, at the threshold of the painting. The boy's hand rests on a terrestrial globe supported by a mahogany base. Likely, it's the one that was found in Washington's study. Wash also grasps a divider, which was a tool of measurement used to draft maps and architectural drawings. Washington Sr., then President of the United States, and donning full military dress, leans on the young boy, who he imagined, perhaps, as the inheritor of his legacy as land surveyor, statesman, plantation owner, and enslaver. The person who occupies the other honorific seat at the table is First Lady and wife Martha Custis Washington, attired in luxurious satin and fine lace. She holds one corner of the centerpiece of the ensemble, a map of Washington City, the new capital 16 miles north on the Potomac, named in honor of her revered husband. Behind the table, Savage positioned Eleanor, Nellie Parke Custis, against the background of trees and rivers. Nellie assists her grandmother in holding the other corner of the map. Whereas Wash, her brother, stands closest to us, the viewers, seemingly free to wander out of the frame and equipped to take measure of the world, the Washingtons frame and shelter Nellie as she practices the protocols and learns the duties of a planter wife and mother from her beloved grandmother. Savage highlighted the first family's faces by encircling each with a luminous halo of white lace that befitted their class status as Virginian elites and their venerated stature as the future of the nation. Now, furthest from the viewer and hemmed into the corner of the domestic scene, Savage placed Washington's young body servant, Christopher Shields. The inclusion of the house servant in this first painting of the first family represents what scholar Simon Giocondi has called, quote, slavery's powerful haunting of the culture of taste, end quote. Note how, in contrast to the family's radiance, Savage portrayed Shields' face in dark tones, with his profile receding into the tree foliage and the massive brick-colored column. His gray shirt and coat may have been sewn from Osnaburg, a coarse linen fabric typically used to fashion slave clothing. Osnaburg also functioned as a visual signifier of Shields' status as a slave. In Savage's rendering, the fabric's coarseness contrasts strikingly against the rich jasper red brocade that upholsters Martha Washington's chair. And it is important to note that Shields was part of the estate of Martha Washington's first husband, Daniel Parke Custis, and therefore he remained her property as a dower slave. Yet, Shields' placement of a hand in his red brass button waistcoat evinced that he was a man of restraint and modesty. Perhaps a nod to the young Colonel Washington's pose in Charles Wilson Peel's portrait that hung in the front parlor of Mount Vernon. Most certainly, Shields' gesture complicates his representation as a family prop and Mrs. Washington's property. Since my first encounter with Savage's painting in the National Gallery several years ago, I've been fascinated with its configuration of the racialized and gendered axes of men and nature, the liberated and the dominated, the owners and the owned. For novelist and scholar Toni Morrison, darkness and blackness was, throughout US history, a strategic cultural trope through which white Americans imagined the self and liberation. Thus, if Christopher Shields belonged to the Washingtons, could he ever belong to himself as a self-possessed, self-determined subject? Could he ever be a citizen of the United States, since the nation's foundational belief radically declared that, quote, all men are created equal? I want to put forward the claim that land served as not only the ground upon which sites like Mount Vernon and the new federal territory and city arose, as drawn on the map on the Washington's table, but also land acquisition enabled by property rights served as the legal substrate for both the establishment of inalienable rights that statesmen like Washington defended and that Jefferson vociferously championed. But also, it stood for the conditions of unfreedom experienced by Christopher Shields and all enslaved and free Black peoples living in the US at that time. So my talk today follows mathematician and surveyor Andrew Ellicott and his team that included free Black mathematician and farmer Benjamin Banneker on their 1791 land survey of the boundaries for the new federal territory on land ceded by Virginia and Maryland. Now, I want us to keep in mind that if the new territory of the District of Columbia and its yet-to-be-planned capital, Washington City, functioned as an architectural symbol of unity between the 13 states and their commitment to uphold and protect the tenets of liberty through self-governance, then how did Banneker's presence on the surveying team, like Shields's presence in the painting, represent divergent beliefs around the natural rights of humans, especially the right to live free? It was a cold, blustery day in February of 1791 when the land surveying team, with equipment in tow, Gunther's chains and a portable zenith sector, headed south from Alexandria, Virginia, a former tobacco station, now bustling port town along the lower Potomac River, whose shores had been the boundary between the Powhatan Confederacy and other Algonquin peoples to the north. A highly respected Pennsylvanian mathematician and surveyor of English Quaker origins, Andrew Ellicott led the team of 4 white Americans and 1 free black surveyor named Benjamin Banneker. Scientifically minded surveyors like Ellicott had the tools and the techniques to measure large territories. Men of his stature and talents were widely admired and in demand. Ellicott, who, along with his fellow Pennsylvanian David Rittenhouse, a celebrated astronomer, inventor, and land surveyor, were the only 2 Americans who possessed the highly skilled prize of being able to craft their own scientific instruments. Together, Ellicott and Rittenhouse had constructed a small portable zenith sector, a type of telescope capable of establishing base meridian lines calibrated to precise celestial observations. And this is what they can do. The 2 collaborated in 1784 in charting the Mason-Dixon line, neatly dividing Maryland, Delaware, and Pennsylvania. The following year, Ellicott would plot the Ellicott line across Pennsylvania to separate it from the indigenous nation's Northwest territories. Given his unparalleled talents, Ellicott could measure with precision the 10-mile boundary lines of the new federal territory. The President of the United States, George Washington, closely working with his Secretary of State, Thomas Jefferson, a former Virginia governor and ambassador to France, charged Ellicott and a survey team with the task of locating the south cornerstone of the preliminary boundary survey for the new federal territory, the future home of the nation's new capital, Washington City. So the team's destination was Jones Point, which sat near the confluence of the Great Hunting Creek and the Potomac River on land once inhabited by an Algonquin tribe, the Netcotchtunk. Now, Washington and Jefferson conveyed coordinates to Ellicott for where he should commence his first measurement. Although Ellicott's superior technical skills determined their starting point to actually be inaccurate. Both sons of wealthy Virginia planters, Washington and Jefferson were capable land surveyors with expertise to calculate coordinates such as these. Prior to military service, for example, Washington had completed over 100 surveys in Virginia. Knowledge of how to conduct a survey was essential for assaying the vast tracts of land owned by Washington, Jefferson, and other planters. Home to Washington's family and his overseers, servants, some indentured, and hundreds of enslaved men, women, and children, Mount Vernon sat 8 miles south of Jones Point. Like his fellow Virginian, Jefferson was also a planter, a slaveholder, and a proficient surveyor, who served for a brief period as the surveyor for Albemarle County, Virginia in 1773, before choosing a more lucrative law career. Jefferson's father, Peter Jefferson, working with surveyor Joshua Fry, completed a survey that created one of the most important maps of 18th century of the Middle Atlantic colonies for Lord Fairfax, who held valuable but disputed lands of the Northern Neck, which included the Shenandoah Valley and tracts along the southern Potomac branch. And this is a topic I will return to in this talk. Both Jefferson and Washington, as planter elites, owned hundreds of enslaved people to make productive those thousands of acres of land. So briefly, let's delve into how families amassed these extensive holdings in land and also in slaves. Now, 100 years before Savage put paint to canvas in his portrait of the Washingtons and their possessions, Englishman John Locke, in his influential Second Treaty on Civil Government, argued that, quote, every man has a property in his own person. Whatsoever then he removes out of the state of nature, mixed with his labor, thereby makes it his property, end quote. Now, if we unpack this famous quote, property in his own person, establish that Locke was free. He was his own person, neither the subject of a lord or monarch. Self-possession thus became foundational to the emerging tenets of modern liberalism. This, in fact, inspired the fiery words of Jefferson, who paraphrased Locke in the Declaration of Independence's clarion call for freedom as an unalienable or inalienable natural right found in, quote, life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness of one's own. Also observe in Locke's statement that the mixing of the labor of his body when removing something, let's say a plant, out of that state of nature allows the plant to be claimed as his own property. Importantly, for Locke, these were natural rights, which eventually became enshrined in modern civil rights and the property rights of individuals. The appropriation of land as a legal and political process to establish ownership was foundational to the formation of the modern nation state, like the United States, and to the creation of the modern self-possessed subject, like the US citizen. Now, it helps to review the history of how vast tracts of land, like those inherited by Washington and Jefferson, were assembled. In Great Britain, Charles I, for instance, sanctioned the creation of joint stock companies like the Virginia Company of London that founded the colony of Virginia in 1607. The king also issued royal charters like the one awarded to a Virginia Company investor, Lord Calvert, who established the Maryland Palatinate in 1632. Through these speculative enterprises of colonies and plantations, knights and gentlemen investors, known as adventurers, along with guilds, amassed substantial wealth through trade and colonization in the Americas and the Caribbean, as well as in Asia, I should add. Now, keep in mind, the legal acquisition of land depended upon incremental encroachment into indigenous land through purchase, theft, treaty, and war. By the start of the Revolutionary War in 1776, Euro-American settlers had claimed most of the eastern seaboard and land hundreds of miles inland. An important detail can be found in how the British Crown in the 17th and 18th century awarded tracts of land to British North American settlers through what were called head rights. The Crown awarded 50 acres for each indentured servant brought over from Europe, or each enslaved African or Native American purchased to work in agriculture, mining, or trade. And this was one process that facilitated enterprising colonists in their accumulation of vast landholdings, and in some cases, hundreds of thousands of acres. So what drove the accumulation of land by European nations like Great Britain and eventually the US that benefited private individuals like Washington, Jefferson, and the Ellicott families was its productive potential. From small farms and plantations to mining and other forms of resource extraction. Therefore, knowledge about how to conduct a land survey was available to colonists in books that outlined basic methods. A surveyor's ability to transform land into fungible, that is, exchangeable, transferable commodity, fueled the westward expansion of the US. That technique of territorialization proved essential for where to locate the new federal territory. The new district's 10 miles by 10 miles rotated square that straddled the snaking bends of the Potomac demonstrates how surveying tools and techniques of measurements imposed abstract Platonic geometries onto natural landscapes. So let's return to our survey. Once the team arrived to the upper cape of Hunting Creek Cove that fed into the Potomac, Ellicott deployed the zenith sector to begin the process of pinpointing the crucial first meridian. So to define the district's southern boundaries, Ellicott extended 2 straight lines, 10 miles long, in first a northeasterly direction, with each calculated at 45-degree angles from the starting point at Jones Point. Over the next 4 weeks, the survey team would employ the zenith sector and other basic surveying tools to overlay the other 2 10-mile vectors on the northern half of the rotated square. They would map out 100 miles in total area onto the land ceded by Maryland and Virginia to the federal government. The team prepared a preliminary survey with a more accurately detailed survey and plan to follow at a later date. Now, Ellicott's assistants were all inexperienced in astronomical land surveying, except Benjamin Banneker, a self-taught mathematician and astronomer. Born free, Banneker was the son of a freed Black farm couple. Though his father had been an enslaved person from Guinea, and his mother was a mixed-race woman born of a white English mother and a formerly enslaved man from Senegambia. Banneker owned a 100-acre farmstead in Baltimore County, Maryland, on land bordering the Ellicott family's grist mill. In the last decade of the 18th century, free Black men like Banneker witnessed their rights infringed upon, including the right to vote, to own property, and to represent their interests in courts of law. Because Maryland's manumission laws determining how enslavers could liberate their slaves were made more stringent after the War for Independence, this also whittled away the rights of free Blacks, many of whom fought in the war on the side of the rebellious colonists. The reality for for most Maryland Blacks was that the majority, 92%, were enslaved. By the time the US Constitution was ratified in 1788, Maryland state law distinguished between Blacks freed after 1783, who had limited rights, and those freed before 1783, who retained, per local customs, full rights of a US citizen, that is, the right to property and to vote. And this latter group included Banneker, since he owned over 50 acres and probably possessed wealth above 30 pounds. Significantly, that group of freed Blacks born before 1783 were most likely to be mixed race, born of a white or mixed mother like Banneker, whose racial status had guaranteed that her infant was born free. Authorities based that condition on old slave codes adopted by Maryland's colonial government beginning in the 1660s that determined a child born to a Black mother or father was automatically enslaved. Virginia passed a similar law at the same time, narrowing it only to Black mothers. These laws exemplify why historian Jennifer Morgan has characterized New World slavery as, quote, hereditary racial slavery, end quote, which means that racial difference began to take on the legal characteristics of property, defined by valuation, possession, and inheritance. So in other words, the status of enslavement was passed on as if it was something that were inherited. At home on his tobacco farm, Banneker taught himself astronomy and how to conduct a land survey by borrowing books and instruments from George Ellicott, a neighbor who became a friend and teacher. Amongst the growing ranks of Quaker abolitionists in Maryland, Delaware, and Eastern Pennsylvania, George Ellicott adopted the role of patron and advocate of Banneker's many impressive talents. Yet, while Banneker practiced the Quaker faith, the church never officially welcomed him as a member. And in 1791, Banneker sought to publish his first almanac for Pennsylvania, Delaware, Maryland, and Virginia, and continued to publish it yearly until 1802. In his almanac, Banneker circulated his astronomical calculations of eclipses, tidal ebbs and flows, and the daily positions of the planets and celestial bodies in the night sky. He also anthologized information that local residents might need over the course of a year, incorporating into his almanac excerpts from other publications touting medicinal cures, horticultural techniques, names of representatives serving in the federal government. You could see Thomas Jefferson listed here as Secretary of State, for example. The dates of court convenings in Maryland, weights and values of coinage, and excerpts from magazines and philosophical tracts. In the 1792 edition of his almanac, Banneker published a text on slavery from Columbian Magazine, perhaps because it included a quote from David Rittenhouse. This text might be of interest to scientifically minded almanac readers because Rittenhouse asserts that Africans have been degraded and, quote, doomed to endless slavery by us, merely because their bodies may be disposed to reflect and absorb the rays of light in a way different from ours, end quote. Even though at one time many Quakers owned slaves, members of the faith like George Ellicott had become more strident and vocal in their efforts to stem slaveholding and terminate slave trading in northern states like Pennsylvania, as well as the Upper South. which encompassed Maryland, Delaware, Virginia. Importantly, Quakers objected to Thomas Jefferson's insistence on the inferior mental abilities of the Negro race, argued in Notes on a State of Virginia, which was published in the US in 1788 and circulated widely by 1791. In last week's Mellon Lecture, I explored the relationship between Notes and Jefferson's design for the Virginia State House, a model for future civic buildings in the US. Now, it is believed that George Ellicott encouraged his cousin, Andrew Ellicott, to hire Banneker after other white surveyors declined the offer to join the federal survey. One can imagine, though we don't have evidence, that Banneker strategically saw the opportunity to join the Historic Land Survey as a means to drum up interest and boost the credibility of his calculations in his forthcoming almanac. Although we have no records of his precise contribution to the survey of the federal territory's outer boundaries, Banneker's expertise with astronomical calibration were probably compatible with Andrew Ellicott's advanced techniques. According to historians, because of Banneker's familiarity with the equipment, Ellicott entrusted him with the care and maintenance of the delicate instruments and to record Ellicott's field calculations. However appreciative and respectful of Banneker's invaluable skills and unique aptitude, Ellicott was obliged to have Banneker dine separately from the rest of the team members. While certain exchanges may be permissible within the Quakers' more liberal sphere of knowledge and financial transactions, Ellicott held fast to the custom of limiting the proximity of Blacks within white social spaces, even free people like Banneker. But nevertheless, Banneker's novel presence on the survey team proved strategically beneficial to the burgeoning abolitionist cause. It was a newsworthy event promoted by abolitionists like George and his brother, Elias Ellicott. To make the point, the Georgetown Weekly Ledger, and this circulated in newspapers actually, widely, the Ledger reported in March of 1791, quote, he, Andrew Ellicott, is attended by Benjamin Banneker, an Ethiopian, whose abilities as a surveyor and astronomer clearly prove that Mr. Jefferson's, and this one it is actually stricken, that Mr. Jefferson's concluding that race of men were void of mental endowments was without foundation, end quote. So Banneker's achievement as a man of science, like Phyllis Wheatley's accomplishment in the realms of arts and letters, as I discussed last week, contradicted Jefferson's assertion in Notes on a State of Virginia that when you compare, quote, them, Black people, by their faculties of reason, of memory, reason, and imagination, it appears to me that in memory they are equal to whites, in reason much inferior, as I think one could scarcely be found capable of tracing and comprehending the investigations of Euclid, end quote. Now, 5 months after his contribution to Ellicott's first survey, Banneker wrote to Jefferson. His primary goal was to promote the publication of his forthcoming 1792 almanac. Along with his letter, Banneker sent Jefferson a handwritten copy of his calculations. In the August 19th, 1791 letter to Jefferson, Banneker's introductory address to the Secretary of State conveyed a tone of great humility and deference. He wrote, quote, I am fully sensible of the greatness of the freedom which I take with you on the present occasion, a liberty which seemed to me scarcely allowable, end quote, especially in light of, quote, the almost general prejudice and prepossession which is so prevalent in the world against those of my complexion, end quote. In the phrase, quote, the freedom which I take with you on the present occasion, end quote, Bannister established that he both comprehended what it meant to be free and that he shared this condition of freedom with Jefferson, albeit for him it was also a precarious one, a, quote, scarcely allowable, end quote, right, not guaranteed by custom or the US Constitution. Clearly, Banneker understood that prejudice posed a persistent threat to what the Enlightenment established as a natural right that all men are born free. Being Black and possessing freedom in Banneker's mind and from a life's worth of experience were not commensurate in this new nation. To give further evidence of the deprivation of the liberties he faced daily, Banneker characterized the dehumanization wrought from racialization and slavery by highlighting that his race of beings have labored under abuse, censure, and contempt. Quote, that we have long been considered rather brutish than human, scarcely capable of mental endowments, end quote. Knowing that Jefferson was revered as a preeminent judge of human nature, Banneker asked why such prejudicial sensibilities, underwritten by Christian morality, prevailed in regards to the abuses of slavery and the equality of all men, even quoting the first words that Jefferson wrote to begin the Declaration of Independence that, quote, we hold these truths to be self-evident that all men are created equal and that they are endowed by their Creator with certain unalienable rights, that among these are life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness, end quote. Having made a calculated argument that slavery unreasonably restricts and immorally curtails the freedom of enslaved Blacks, as well as those like himself and his family, free Blacks, Banneker used the rest of his letter to promote his almanac, evidence of his own aptitudes as a man of science and naturalist, which he hoped that Jefferson would review and circulate amongst his naturalist interlocutors, which actually Jefferson did. That a Black man would enter into the conversation of preeminent white men of science like Rittenhouse, Ellicott, and Jefferson required Banneker to make it known to his almanac readers that the information important for navigation and farming was, quote, calculated by a sable descendant of Africa who, by the specimen of ingenuity, evinces to demonstration the mental powers and endowments are not exclusive excellence of white people, but the rays of science might illumine the minds of men of every clime, however they may differ in the color of their skin, end quote. Banneker showed himself to be both a man of reason and a man of the marketplace, a strategy for survival under racial capitalism deployed by Wheatley as explored in last week's lecture. Now, within 10 days, Jefferson responded to Banneker. The Secretary of State expressed his gratitude for Banneker's letter. In contrast to his earlier well-known postulation in Notes on the State of Virginia that Blacks were naturally inferior, a position abhorred by abolitionists like the Ellicott brothers and their fellow Quakers, Jefferson wavered based on, quote, proofs you exhibit that nature has given to our Black brethren talents equal to those of the other colors of men, and that the appearance of a want in them is owing merely to a degraded condition of their existence, both in Africa and America, end quote. To any man of science, the almanac's astronomical calculations served as evidence of Banneker's intelligence and abilities. Perhaps because Banneker astutely sent Jefferson a manuscript written in his own hand, these, quote, proofs as you exhibit, end quote, prevented the latter from making the argument that someone else might have written the calculations. In this case, Jefferson did not question the authorship of Banneker's work, as he had previously done with Wheatley in Notes. Suggesting that there might be a process for the emancipation of enslaved Blacks, Jefferson shared with Banneker that, quote, nobody wishes more ardently to see a good system commenced for raising the condition of both the body and mind to what it ought to be, as fast as the imbecility of their present existence and other circumstances which cannot be neglected will admit, end quote. That slavery had degraded the intellectual and physical conditions of enslaved and free Blacks, rather than natural predisposition, was possible based on Banneker's remarkable accomplishments and abilities. That there should be efforts launched to improve their plight was clearly a moral imperative. But Jefferson seemed to hedge on when this would be possible, writing when circumstances admit. To be sure, this recognition of Banneker's perhaps innate talents was for Jefferson a scientific judgment and not a political one. As the Secretary of State, he did not in any way suggest that, despite the sable astronomer's ardent plea, that slaves in the US would be freed. So if the federal territory and soon-to-be designed federal city functioned as an architectural symbol of the union between 13 states and their commitment to Republican values of liberty, then the presence of Banneker on the surveying team for that unparalleled project represented divergent positions on the natural rights of humans, especially if Blacks should remain enslaved or free. Clearly, Banneker's contribution to Ellicott's survey in his own almanac provided white abolitionists with a potent argument that slavery was a moral abdication of the natural rights of human equality. This would become an increasingly thorny issue as to whether states or the federal government had jurisdiction over this question, one that harbored the potential to tear apart the fragile threads of national unity as the continued expropriation of the lands inhabited by indigenous people continued and the incorporation of the Northwest Territories challenged the spread of slavery. On March 28th of 1791, Ellicott presented the survey documents to President Washington in Georgetown, a small town on the Maryland side of the Potomac, which was established in 1751 on land that had been a Nacotchtank village. Georgetown began as a tobacco station, grew into a port town, and now was inside the boundaries, like Alexandria, of the new federal territory. 2 weeks later, the 3 commissioners selected by Washington to oversee the construction of Washington City joined an entourage of politicians and prominent citizens from Alexandria to place a cornerstone at Jones Point to mark the southernmost extension of the new federal territory. The new commissioners of public buildings were Thomas Johnson, First Continental Congress delegate, judge, planter, and Maryland's first governor; Daniel Carroll, Jr., a former Maryland congressional representative, signatory of the Constitution, and a planter from a prominent Catholic family; and David Stewart. Could not find a painting of David Stewart. But he was a planter and a lawyer from Virginia who was also Washington's stepson-in-law and stepfather to Nellie and Wash. The selection of the new federal territory's location, without recounting years of political wrangling, was the outcome of rancorous public negotiations amid various factions of Northerners and Southerners who held an array of political ambitions and economic rationales. The site along the Potomac emerged from backroom negotiations. That's the room where it happened, if you're Hamilton fans. Which many saw as fundamentally undemocratic between powerful statesmen, among them Washington, Jefferson, Congressman Planter, James Madison of Virginia, and the Treasury Secretary Alexander Hamilton of New York. Most importantly, the factors determining where the new federal territory would rise, I want to argue, was property. The right to possess humans as property and access to indigenous lands to convert into private property. Before the US Capitol was finished, Philadelphia's Pennsylvania State House, also known as Independence Hall, because of its storied history as the site of the signing of the Declaration of Independence, hosted the meetings of the Continental Congresses before and during the Revolutionary War. It was also the venue for the first 10 Confederate Congresses convened between, one of the venues of the 10 Confederate Congresses convened between 1781 and 1789 until the US Congress took shape with the ratification of the Constitution. Now, as a busy mercantile port city and Quaker stronghold, Philadelphia posed challenges for some congressmen, especially those who traveled with enslaved servants. Because in 1780, Pennsylvania's legislature had passed the Act for the Gradual Abolition of Slavery. Under this law, Pennsylvania residents had to annually register their enslaved persons. They could not import slaves from out of state. Any enslaved child born after 1780 would be freed upon the age of 28, and non-residents were only allowed to own enslaved people for up to 6 months, after which an enslaved person was legally free. And it was the last one that was the most problematic for the congressmen. This act led different factions, including Southern representatives who long harbored resentment of the city's abolitionist sentiments, to pressure to move future congressional sessions elsewhere. Now, throughout his presidency, the Washingtons traveled with an entourage of enslaved household servants from Mount Vernon, first to New York City, and then to the president's house, a row house in Philadelphia, where they resided from 1790 to 1797. In her role as a planter wife, Martha Custis Washington oversaw all households and, in fact, owned many of the enslaved workers at Mount Vernon, which she had inherited from her first husband's estate. Now, the First Lady held concerns that residing long-term in Philadelphia would embolden their enslaved servants to flee. Those slaves in the presidential household, Ona Judge, Austin, Ona's brother, Moll, Giles, Paris, Hercules, Richmond, and Christopher Shields easily heard about the new gradual abolition laws because they lived and circulated amongst the city's freed Black population, which numbered around 1,800 at that time. So not only did Philadelphia pass an abolition law, but it also developed an infrastructure to aid those seeking freedom. The Free African Society, formed in 1787 by freed Blacks Richard Allen and Absalom Jones, and these are amazing portraits by Raphael Peale, who's the son of Charles Wilson Peale, showed you their stature because they were painted. They had portraits painted at the time. So Allen and Jones provided mutual aid to those newly liberated, and the society became foundational to the city's independent Black Protestant church movement. Intent on holding on to their investment in human property, the president and his wife implemented a rotation system that sent slaves back to Mount Vernon before the 6-month residency limit had been reached, right? So it was like you keep them there for 5 months and then you send them back, and that way, they don't have to be liberated. But despite their scheme, one woman, Ona Judge, a personal servant to Martha Washington, who had been born to an enslaved Black mother and an indentured white father at Mount Vernon, learned of the possibility of gaining her freedom. As historian Erica Armstrong Dunbar describes, quote, "On Saturday, May 21, 1796, Ona Judge slipped out of the executive mansion while the Washingtons ate their supper. She disappeared into the free Black community of Philadelphia," end quote. Though the Washingtons posted advertisements seeking Judge's return, she was never apprehended and died a free woman in New Hampshire in 1848. Now, if the capital were to remain permanently located in Philadelphia, slaveholding Southern congressmen and government officials like Washington and Jefferson had astutely feared the loss of their valuable human property. Therefore, paramount to Washington and Jefferson was to maintain the union and the balance of power between state and federal governments and prevent the question of the location of the capital to become divisive to the federal union. Choosing a suitable place would hinge, one, on the future expansion of the nation's boundaries westward into indigenous lands, and two, whether slaveholding would expand into those new territories. In this regard, the Potomac River presented an ideal location, particularly those areas above the fall line, which occurred at Little Falls, where the loamy, sandy loam of the tidewater met the rocky upsurge of the Piedmont. Now, at the negotiations of the Treaty of Paris, signed in 1783, the British Crown conceded to the newly free and sovereign independent states the colonized Northwest Territories, a vast area west to the Mississippi River. Now, the Virginia colony had chartered in 1748, for example, the Loyal Company, whose investors sought land speculation, trade, and settlement of the area west of the Alleghenies, which is what is now known as West Virginia. Now, one investor and company director, Peter Jefferson, father of Thomas Jefferson, was enlisted to survey the territory. And in 1755, Peter Jefferson and Joshua Fry, also a land surveyor and Loyal Company investor, produced, as I said, one of the most detailed maps of the region for the Crown's commissioners in trade and plantations. The map claimed lands for settlement and trade that were the domains of the Six Nations, the Iroquois and Haudenosaunee Confederacy of Tuscarora, Seneca, Mohawk, Cayuga, and Oneida and Onondaga Indians. Artist Francis Hayman's scenographic cartouche on the map depicts the activities of a fictional port where 4 white merchants sip wine while transacting businesses of trade against a backdrop of enslaved, half-clothed servants and laborers. These might be enslaved Africans or enslaved Native Americans, it's unclear, who pack and load hogsheads of tobacco onto boats. Now, at the same time the Loyal Company was established, the Virginia colony also chartered another land speculation venture that laid claim to 500,000 acres in the Ohio Valley. Investors formed the Ohio Company of Virginia to sell land to European settlers attracted by the area's lucrative fur trade, and to halt the construction of forts by the French in what the British claimed as their territory. George Washington, along with his half-brothers, Lawrence and Augustine Washington, were key investors in the Ohio Company. Notably, Washington had been purchasing and selling land since he had acquired his first tract in 1752. By the time he was president and given the power to select the site for the new capital, Washington had amassed thousands of acres. Historian Kenneth R. Bowling parses that, quote, 4 water routes from the west to the Atlantic existed. The Great Lakes Mohawk-Hudson route to New York City, the Ohio-Allegheny-Susquehanna to Baltimore or Philadelphia, depending on which of these rival cities gained control of it, the Ohio-Monongahela-Potomac to Georgetown and Alexandria, and the Ohio-Great Kanawha, James to Richmond. Washington had land investments on all but the Susquehanna route, end quote. Now, Washington had been an early advocate of clearing the Potomac River, which required the building of a series of canal locks beginning at Little Falls, 3.5 miles north of Georgetown, to navigate major rapids. The proposed locks terraced the 275-mile-long Potomac to make the waterway navigable. Access would increase the values of his holdings in what is now Pennsylvania, West Virginia, Ohio, and Kentucky, acreage that Washington claimed through purchase from his surveying explorations and as payment for leading troops in the Virginia Regiment in the 7 Years' War. Washington had joined Thomas Johnson before he was a Washington City Commissioner to promote a 1774 bill in the colonial Maryland legislature to launch an effort to tame the Potomac. That didn't happen. 10 years later, and after the war, Maryland, under Johnson's governorship, chartered the Potomac Company. Virginia joined the charter a year later. Now, if successful, constructing locks up the Potomac would open a reliable, safe route to transport raw materials from Western territories to Eastern ports and to make the waterway attractive to manufacturers. A navigable waterway would also facilitate the transit of Euro-American settlers to the territories where they could then purchase parcels of land sold by land speculators like Washington. So to lead the new Potomac companies, the directors elected George Washington as its president in 1784, and the Virginia legislature gave him company shares to seal the deal. Maryland congressional representative Daniel Carroll, a future Washington City Commissioner, took on the role as temporary chair. And Thomas Johnson became the Potomac Company's second president in 1789 when Washington resigned the post after his election to become the first U.S. president. And while the expertise of engineers and surveyors was a critical part of the development of the Potomac Company's canal system, the company still needed physical labor to remove rocks and cut down trees, as well as dig and lay miles of foundation walls for the canal. Initially, the company sought free white labor for these tasks. However, they encountered a shortage of available workers. Efforts to lure white indentured servants from Europe also failed. So in response, the owners of the company had to contract slave labor from nearby plantations. So the company rented enslaved men and boys from planters on a yearly, quarterly, and daily basis to complete the back-breaking work. So as previously stated, in April of 1791, Washington named his Potomac Company's collaborators, Thomas Johnson and Daniel Carroll, along with David Stewart, as the commissioners of public buildings in charge of overseeing the construction of Washington City. Clearly, 2 of the 3 commissioners shared expertise through their work with the Potomac Company. They understood that large infrastructural projects required negotiating land purchase, hiring experts, procuring materials, and finding workers, free and enslaved, skilled and unskilled. As my third lecture next week will explore, that same model for employing enslaved labor was adopted to clear the land, quarry materials, and construct the new capital city. Thus, while Ellicott was busy with Banneker and his team measuring the precise lines that would define the outer boundaries of the District of Columbia, President Washington hired former military officer, surveyor, and architect Pierre Charles L'Enfant to conceive of a plan for a new Washington city. L'Enfant's design, a grid bisected with wide avenues, located the Congress House, which would become the U.S. Capitol, and the President's Palace, which Jefferson renamed the President's House sans the imperial overtones. Now, eventually, both Ellicott and, the first map was L'Enfant, this is Ellicott's map. Both Ellicott and L'Enfant worked in the field, aided by free and enslaved workers, to survey the former plantations that would become Washington City to produce a detailed map of the proposed city with enumerated blocks and lots. Their printed map circulated widely to stoke interest in the auctions of the lots. Those who purchased the properties, like Washington, who bought 9 lots, would then be responsible for improving the parcels with new building. And from the money earned from eager land speculators, the federal government would fund the construction of its 2 main buildings to house its legislative and executive functions. The creation of the federal territory and city would encompass one of the largest efforts at city building in the modern Euro-American world. And first and foremost, it was the ownership of land and humans, what Locke had originally stipulated as life, liberty, and the pursuit of property, that paid for the ground upon which the new capital, Washington City, in the District of Columbia, would rise along the banks of the Potomac. Thank you.
I want to thank you all for being with us this week. Please join us again next week, same place, same time, for Professor Wilson's third lecture. Have a great rest of your day. Thank you.